The Apache scout who tracked Geronimo for 1,000 miles then watched the army break every promise, so he walked into Mexico and joined the man he hunted, is a story my grandfather used to tell me in the driveway while the crickets were screaming in the weeds. But he never told me why he really stopped in the middle of it whenever the neighbor's porch light flickered on. He'd just stare at that light, his fingers twitching against the hood of his old Ford, and then he'd say, "Kid, there's a difference between a hunter and a man who's just lost his way home." I didn't know then that he was talking about himself, or that one day I'd be sitting here in a room that feels too quiet, listening to the hum of my own refrigerator, wondering if that scout ever actually found the piece he was looking for when he stepped across that line. I was 19, living in a town in Ohio where the biggest thing that happened all week was the Friday night football game or the high school gym catching fire because someone left a space heater on too long. My world was small, square, and predictable. I worked at the auto shop on Main, smelling like gasoline and cheap coffee, and I had a girl named Sarah who smelled like vanilla shampoo and had a laugh that made me think the world was a lot bigger and kinder than it really was. We'd sit on the hood of my truck, watching the stars, talking about maybe moving to the coast, or just saving enough for down payment on a place with a porch that didn't sag. I believed in the future back then. I believed it was something you earned by showing up on time and doing what you were told. I was proud, too. My old man had served, his old man had served, and it felt like the natural order of things, like gravity. I wanted to be part of something that mattered, something bigger than fixing brakes on sedans and worrying about the price of a gallon of milk. I signed the papers on a Tuesday morning. The office smelled like lemon floor wax and dusty files. The recruiter didn't look like a hero. He looked like a guy who'd been sitting in that chair for 20 years, just waiting for the next kid to walk in and hand him a life. He told me I had a good head on my shoulders, that the infantry was where the real work was. I didn't ask what the work was. I thought I knew. I thought it was about flags and honor and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. I walked out of that office feeling like I'd just stepped into a larger version of my own life. I called Sarah from a payphone, my heart hammering against my ribs, and told her I'd done it. There was a silence on the other end, that specific kind of silence that feels like a weight being dropped into deep water. She didn't say she was proud. She didn't say she was scared. She just asked if I'd be home for Christmas. I told her of course I would, like it was a fact, like the calendar was a promise the world was required to keep. The bus ride to Fort Benning was the last time I felt like a civilian. It was a blur of highway signs and cheap snacks and guys I didn't know yet, all of us trying to act like we weren't terrified of the unknown. I spent most of the trip looking out the window at the cornfields turning into scrub brush and pine trees, wondering if I'd left my soul back in that auto shop on Main. We arrived in the middle of the night, the barracks looking like long, dark fingers reaching out of the earth. We were yelled at immediately. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and sweat, and that unique metallic tang of machinery. My drill sergeant was a man made of gravel and bad intentions. He didn't care about my plans or my girl or my dreams of a down payment. He cared about whether I could tie my boots in the dark and whether I could move when I was so tired my vision started to tunnel. I met Miller there. Miller was from a farm in Nebraska, a guy who could strip a rifle faster than he could peel an apple. He had a way of looking at a problem like it was just another chore to be finished. We spent the nights, when we were supposed to be sleeping, whispering about home. He talked about his sister's wedding, about the way the wind sounded in the wheat, and how he couldn't wait to get back and fix the tractor his dad had been putting off for months. We made jokes about the chow hall, about the way the eggs looked like yellow rubber, and we laughed until our ribs ached because if we stopped laughing, the reality of where we were and where we were eventually going would have crushed us right then and there. I loved Miller in a way that's hard to put into words. It wasn't like loving Sarah. It was a shared survival. It was a recognition that we were two halves of a whole, and that if one of us broke, the other would have to be the one to carry the pieces. The months went by in a haze of physical misery and mental sharpening. We were being forged, or so they told us. I remember the weight of the ruck, the straps digging into my collarbones until I couldn't feel my arms anymore. I remember the sound of boots on pavement, that rhythmic, hollow thud that becomes the heartbeat of your existence. I started to forget what it felt like to be cold in the Ohio winter. I started to forget what it felt like to be anything other than a gear in a machine that was being wound tighter every single day. The pride was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched out over muscles that were leaner and eyes that were starting to scan the horizon even when we were just standing in line for dinner. I wrote letters to Sarah every chance I got. I told her about the training, but I left out the parts about the bruises and the exhaustion and the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking sometimes when I finally got a moment of stillness. I told her I loved her, and every time I wrote it, it felt like I was shouting into a canyon, waiting for an echo that took longer and longer to reach me. She wrote back, her handwriting neat and careful, telling me about her shift at the diner and how her mom had been asking after me. It was a different language, her world. It was a world of menus and movies and small, inconsequential dramas. I found myself reading her letters and feeling a strange, hollow ache in my chest. I wanted to be back in that world, but I felt like I was already a ghost, walking through it from a distance, watching a life I didn't recognize anymore. We were deployed in the spring. The flight was long, the air in the cabin recirculating until it tasted like stale breath and jet fuel. I sat next to Miller. He was staring at his hands, his knuckles white. I leaned over and asked him if he was all right. He looked at me, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, and said, "Just thinking about that tractor, man. It's going to be a hell of a job." We laughed, but it didn't reach our eyes. The plane landed, and when the ramp lowered, the heat hit us like a physical blow. It was a dry, heavy heat, the smell of burning trash and dust and something else, something primal and old. The base was a fortress of concrete and razor wire, a tiny patch of order in a land that seemed to have forgotten the concept. We were processed into the unit, the faces around us tired and worn, eyes that had seen too much and were looking for something they'd never find. I remember the sergeant major, a man whose skin looked like cured leather, staring at us during the briefing. He didn't give a speech about freedom or destiny. He just told us to watch the road, to keep our heads down, and to look after the man to our left and right. He said it like he was giving us directions to the grocery store. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me. We started running patrols the second week. The landscape was jagged, all brown hills and hidden valleys that seemed to swallow sound. The tension was constant, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in your teeth. You'd walk for hours, watching the scrub brush for a glint of metal or a disturbance in the dust. Every muscle in your body coiled like a spring. We were waiting for something to happen, and the waiting was worse than the action. You'd catch yourself thinking about home, about the smell of rain on hot asphalt in July, and then you'd catch yourself in the act of remembering, feeling like you were betraying the job at hand. It was a strange kind of guilt, the guilt of being anywhere else in your head, but right there in that dirt. There was a kid in our squad named Davis. He was 18, barely old enough to vote, and he had a collection of photos of his golden retriever that he'd show to anyone who would look. He'd talk for hours about how he was going to teach that dog to catch a frisbee properly once he got back. I'd listen, nodding, thinking that the dog was probably the only thing in the world that was actually waiting for him. I felt protective of him, the way you feel about something fragile that you're forced to carry through a storm. I didn't want to think about what the world might do to him. I just wanted to make sure he made it back to that dog. We moved through villages where the people looked at us like we were ghosts, or maybe like we were a disease they were trying to ignore. They weren't hostile, not always, but they were distant, their eyes sliding away from ours. It made me feel like an intruder in a house where I wasn't wanted, even though I was doing exactly what I was told. I started to notice things, the way a door stood slightly open, the way a group of men would stop talking as soon as we rounded the corner, the way the wind seemed to carry secrets we weren't allowed to hear. I felt the history of the place, the deep, ancient weight of conflict that predated our arrival by centuries, and it made our mission feel small, like trying to sweep back the ocean with a broom. Miller kept us sane. He had this dark, biting humor that would come out at the worst possible moments. Once, during a particularly brutal sandstorm where we couldn't see our own boots, he looked at me and yelled over the wind, "If I die out here, I want you to make sure they send my body back in a first-class seat." I laughed so hard I nearly choked on the grit, and for a second the terror was gone, replaced by the absurdity of the situation. It was a way to keep from snapping, to keep the edges of our minds from fraying under the strain. We weren't fighting for a cause anymore. We were fighting for each other, for the promise that we'd all walk back onto that plane together. I remember a night on a ridge, the sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled salt on a velvet cloth. We were on watch, the silence heavy and absolute. I asked Miller if he ever thought about what we were doing, if it all meant anything. He didn't answer for a long time. He just leaned back against the rocks, looking up at the Milky Way. "I think," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "that we're just the latest people to walk across this dirt. Everyone thinks they're the ones to fix it, to change it, to make it theirs. But the dirt, it stays. The mountains, they stay. We're just passing through, kid. Don't look for meaning in the sand. Look for it in the guy next to you." I held onto those words. They became my compass. The weeks turned into months, and the blur of the days started to sharpen into specific, jagged moments. A flash of light in the distance. The sudden, sharp pop of a single rifle shot that sent us diving into the ditch. The way the radio would crackle with static, a voice on the other end giving coordinates for places we couldn't pronounce and didn't know. We became efficient. We moved in silence, our bodies reacting before our minds even registered the danger. I wasn't the same kid who worked in the auto shop. That kid was gone, replaced by someone who knew how to wait, how to scan, how to hold his breath until his lungs burned. I didn't feel broken, not yet. I felt like I was being honed, stripped down to the essentials. One day we were tasked with securing a sector near an old, crumbling village that sat in a valley like a forgotten secret. The intelligence report said it was clear, but the air felt wrong. It felt heavy, expectant. We were walking in a single file, the heat rising in waves off the ground when we hit the tree line. Miller was point. He stopped suddenly, his hand held up to signal a halt. The world went absolutely still. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. I saw Miller stiffen, his eyes fixed on something just past the bend in the path. He didn't turn around. He just said one word, his voice as steady as if he were ordering a coffee. Mine. He didn't scream it. He didn't drop. He just moved, his body turning into a blur of motion as he lunged toward the tall, yellowed grass to his left, his hands signaling us to scatter. It happened in the time it takes for a heartbeat to stutter. There was no explosion, not at first. There was a sickening, wet thud, the sound a sack of flour makes when it hits a hard floor, followed by the jagged, tearing rip of an automatic weapon firing from somewhere we couldn't see. My brain didn't catch up to the reality for what felt like 10 minutes, even though it was maybe 3 seconds. I hit the dirt, the grit tasting of sulfur and old rot against my tongue, my rifle pressed into the hollow of my shoulder. My heart wasn't just beating, it was slamming against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. I looked over at Miller. He wasn't moving. He was face down in the dirt, the back of his fatigues already turning a dark, heavy shade of crimson that seemed to drink the sunlight. The air went electric. My squad leader, a guy named Henderson who never raised his voice, started screaming coordinate adjustments into the radio, his voice cracking with a terrifying, jagged edge. We returned fire, not at anything in particular, just at the tree line, at the shadows, at the very idea of the enemy. The world devolved into noise. It was a roar that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the valley, a symphony of chaos where every sound was magnified until it felt like it was happening inside my own skull. I saw Davis to my right, his face drained of all color, his eyes wide and fixed on nothing. He was firing, but his hands were shaking so hard the barrel of his rifle was dancing in frantic, useless circles. I wanted to reach out, to tell him to breathe, to tell him to focus on the sight picture, but I couldn't move. I was pinned by the sudden, freezing realization that the thin line between being a man and being a corpse had just been erased. I remember the smell more than anything. It was copper, sharp, metallic, and sickeningly sweet. It was the smell of a machine shop floor after a bad accident, mixed with the scorched scent of cordite and the dusty, stale odor of the earth being churned up by bullets. Every time a round kicked up dirt near my face, I'd blink, and for a split second, I'd see my truck back in Ohio, the paint flaking off the bumper, the way the late afternoon sun hit the windshield. It was a vivid, cruel hallucination. I wanted to be there. I wanted to be anywhere but in that dirt, with the sound of Miller's silence ringing louder than the gunfire. "Get him," Henderson roared, his boot slamming into my shoulder to wake me from the trance. I scrambled forward, dragging my body through the brush, my fingers clawing at the dry, abrasive soil. I reached Miller and grabbed his vest, pulling him toward the shadow of a rock outcropping. His body was heavy dead weight, the way a person is only when the spirit has already packed up and left. I turned him over, my hands slick with that warm, dark fluid, and I saw his face. He looked surprised. Just surprised, like someone who'd walked into a surprise party they weren't ready for. The humor, the sarcasm, the talk about the tractor. It was all gone, evaporated into the heat. I pressed my hand against the wound in his chest, trying to stop it, to hold the life inside him, but the blood just kept welling up between my fingers, hot and relentless. I started talking to him. I don't know what I said. I think I was apologizing. I think I was telling him about the drive we were going to take when we got back, about how we'd finally get that burger he'd talked about 1,000 times. I felt like a liar. Every word felt like a betrayal of the truth staring back at me from his blank, wide-open eyes. I felt a surge of rage so intense it made my vision pulse white. It wasn't directed at the enemy. It was directed at the world, at the sky, at the cruel, indifferent geometry of the situation. Why him? Why not me? Why does the dirt get to stay and Miller has to turn into dust? Keep moving. Henderson screamed from behind a wall of gunfire, his voice strained and raw. I had to leave him. I couldn't carry him, and if I stayed, I was just another casualty waiting to happen. I looked at Miller one last time, my hand still wet with his life, and I felt a piece of myself, the part that believed in the future, the part that believed in gravity and order, simply snap off and drift away. I grabbed my rifle, my knuckles white, and I stood up. The world tilted. I didn't care about cover. I didn't care about the incoming fire. I just ran, my boots pounding the earth, moving toward the source of the noise with a cold, hollow desperation that I'd never known before. We cleared the tree line, but there was nothing left to find. Just empty shell casings, a few discarded wrappers, and the fading sound of a vehicle engine roaring off into the distance. They were gone. They had hit us, taken what they wanted, and vanished like smoke in a breeze. The silence that followed was worse than the firing. It was a vacuum, an absolute lack of sound that made my ears ring. I walked back to where Miller was lying. The guys had gathered around him, their faces twisted into masks of gray, hard-edged grief. Nobody was crying. We didn't cry. We just stood there looking at our boots, unable to look at each other, as if doing so would reveal the terrified, broken children we really were. The medic was there, shaking his head, his hands covered in blood that wasn't his. He didn't have to say anything. We all knew. The reality of it settled over us like a shroud. I walked away from the group, out toward the edge of the clearing, and stared at the hills. They were still there, the same brown, jagged shapes they'd been that morning. They didn't care. The sun continued to climb, indifferent to the mess we were making of the dirt. I felt a laugh building in my throat, a hysterical, jagged thing. It would be so easy to just start screaming. It would be so easy to throw my weapon into the dust and walk away, to keep walking until I found an ocean or a cliff or a place where the world finally ended. But I didn't. I just stood there, my uniform stiffening with drying blood, and watched a hawk circle high above us, catching the thermals, completely unaware that a man named Miller had just ceased to exist. We waited for the bird, the long, grueling wait for the medevac that felt like it took years. During that time, the world kept moving. A breeze kicked up, rustling the dry grass, carrying the faint, sweet scent of sage. A radio operator from another squad started arguing with someone on the other end of the line about supply chains, his voice tinny and irritating against the backdrop of our silence. I looked at the guy, wanting to jump on him, to choke him, to make him understand that nothing mattered, that supply chains and logistics and mission reports were all just elaborate lies we told ourselves to pretend we were human. But I didn't move. I just looked at my hands, the dried blood flaking off in red scales, and felt an absolute, bone-deep fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep. When the bird finally arrived, the rotor wash kicked up a storm of dust and grit, blinding us, forcing us to crouch and shield our faces. It was violent, noisy, and chaotic, a machine built for war coming to collect its due. We loaded Miller onto the stretcher. I held the edge of the canvas, his weight shifting as the wind tore at us, and for a moment I felt like I was holding onto his life one last time. We slid him inside, the interior of the chopper smelling of grease and stale sweat. Then the door slammed shut, the latches clicking with a metallic finality that sounded like a coffin lid. The bird lifted off, banking hard, and within seconds it was just a tiny, retreating black speck against the vast, empty sky. We were left on the ground. We were still there. We still had a mission. The squad leader, Henderson, wiped his face with a filthy rag, looked at each of us, and said, "We keep moving. We finished the sector." He didn't ask if we were ready. He didn't offer a pep talk. He just turned around and started walking, his pace steady, his shoulders hunched against the heat. I followed him. We all followed him. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, heavy and detached, but I put one foot in front of the other. That was the law now. You don't get to stop because you're broken. You don't get to sit down because your best friend is on a helicopter going in the wrong direction. You move or you die, or you become a ghost that haunts the periphery of your own life. The rest of that day was a blur of shadows and sharp, jagged edges. We moved through the village again, checking rooms that smelled of damp mud and old blankets, our weapons tucked tight into our shoulders. Every doorway was a potential ambush. Every window was a staring eye. I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt a kind of hollow, vibrating nothingness. I found myself thinking about Miller's sister, about how he had talked about her wedding, and how someone would have to tell her he wasn't coming home to fix that tractor. Who does that? Who makes that phone call? I pictured the scene, a suburban house, a screen door slamming, a uniformed officer standing on the porch, and it felt like a scene from a movie I'd seen once, long ago, in a life that belonged to a different person. I saw a child in the village, a girl with dark eyes and dusty hair, standing in the doorway of a shack, watching us. She wasn't afraid. She just looked at us with a kind of weary recognition, as if she'd seen this show 1,000 times before. I wanted to wave at her, to offer her some of the hard candy I kept in my pocket, but I didn't. I kept my eyes locked on the perimeter, my finger hovering near the trigger, a soldier doing his job. I wondered if she'd remember us when she grew up, or if we'd just be another hazy memory of men in tan uniforms who walked through her valley and changed the color of the dirt for a day. I felt a surge of jealousy. I was jealous of her because her world was here, and mine was thousands of miles away, and I knew with a sudden, sinking certainty that I could never go back. Not to the town in Ohio, not to the auto shop, not to the porch with the sagging wood. The bridge was burned. I was standing on the other side, and the fire was still licking at my heels. As the sun began to set, the sky turned a bruised, deep purple, the heat finally relenting, replaced by a thin, biting chill that seeped into my skin. We made camp in the ruins of an old wall, the stones cool and rough against my back. Nobody spoke. We ate our rations in the dark, the sound of spoons scraping against plastic containers the only noise. It was a sound I'll hear for the rest of my life. It was the sound of us trying to keep our bodies alive while our minds were somewhere else, somewhere in that helicopter with Miller. Davis sat across from me, his head in his hands, his shoulders heaving with silent, shuddering breaths. I wanted to reach out to put a hand on his back, but I couldn't. I felt like if I touched anyone, I'd shatter. I was holding myself together by the sheer force of my will, and any contact felt like an invitation to collapse. I thought about Sarah. I reached into my pocket and felt the corner of her last letter. I didn't pull it out. I didn't want to see her handwriting, the neat, cheerful script that belonged to a girl who believed in the future. I felt a strange, cold resentment toward her. She didn't know. She couldn't know. She was living in a world of vanilla shampoo and Friday night football, while I was sitting here in the dirt with the ghost of a man who died for a patch of scrub brush that didn't have a name. I wondered if I should write her, if I should tell her what happened, but what would I say? Asterisk, dear Sarah, Miller is dead. I have his blood under my fingernails, and I think I might be dead too, but my heart is still beating, which is the most annoying part. Asterisk, no, that wasn't a letter. That was a confession, and she didn't deserve to be burdened with the truth. The night stretched out, infinite and cold. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that flash, that wet thud, the way Miller's face looked when he hit the dirt. I saw it in slow motion, every detail etched into my brain in high resolution. The way a single fly landed on his hand, the way his boot was kicked slightly at an angle, the way the light died in his eyes. I kept replaying it, trying to change the outcome, trying to yell at him to move, to stop him from going to that spot, but the outcome never changed. It was fixed, immutable. The tragedy of it wasn't the violence, it was the precision. The way 1 second you're a living, breathing person who wants a burger and misses his dad's tractor, and the next, you're a problem for a casualty team to sort out. I watched the stars wheel slowly overhead. They were the same stars I'd looked at from the hood of my truck, but they looked different here. They looked cold, distant, and uncaring. I felt a strange sense of clarity, a sharp, biting awareness of how thin the crust of civilization really was. We walked around, talking about politics and gas prices and football, acting like we were in control, but we were just walking on a thin sheet of ice over a dark, deep ocean. I finally understood what my grandfather meant about the hunter and the man who'd lost his way home. We were all hunters here, hunting for a reason, hunting for a way to justify the horror, but we were all just lost. The path behind us had disappeared, and the path ahead was obscured by the smoke of a war that refused to end. I woke up at dawn, my body stiff and aching, the dampness of the earth soaked into my clothes. The rest of the squad was already up, moving with a robotic, mechanical efficiency. We didn't talk about Miller. We didn't mention his name. It was as if he'd been a ghost all along, someone we'd imagined, someone who didn't fit into the brutal, waking reality of the morning. We packed our gear, checked our weapons, and started moving again. The terrain looked even more alien in the morning light, the shadows long and deep, hiding things I didn't want to see. We walked for hours, the heat rising again, the dust clinging to our skin, the routine taking over. I was walking point now, the position Miller had held. Every step was a calculation, a test of my reflexes and my nerves. I looked at the ground, searching for tripwires, for disturbed earth, for any sign that the landscape had been tampered with. I wasn't just looking for enemies, I was looking for patterns, for the logic behind the chaos, but there was no logic. There was only the randomness of the bullet and the absolute, terrifying silence of the aftermath. I stopped at a bend in the path, the same kind of bend where it happened, and I felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated fear. It wasn't the movie kind of fear. It was a physical, hollow sensation, like my stomach had been replaced by a block of ice. My hands were shaking again, but I forced them to stay steady, gripping the rifle with a pressure that turned my knuckles white. "Keep it moving," Henderson murmured as he passed me, his voice devoid of emotion. He didn't look at me. He just walked, his eyes scanning the horizon, his posture slumped. He was carrying the same weight I was, only he was doing a better job of hiding it. I watched him go, feeling a strange, hollow respect for him. He was a survivor, a man who had learned how to compartmentalize, how to pack his grief into a box and seal it shut until he was alone. I wanted to be like him. I wanted to be able to just walk away from the hole in my chest and keep going, but I didn't know how. I was still bleeding, even if it was all on the inside. We reached a small, abandoned compound by midday, a collection of mud brick walls and a collapsed roof. We took shelter in the shade, the air thick with the smell of baked clay and dried dung. I sat against the wall, my eyes closing, and for a few minutes I let myself imagine I was back in the shop. I could smell the grease, hear the rattle of the old compressor, feel the cool air of the morning before the day turned hot. I could hear Sarah laughing, that clear, bright sound that felt like a bell ringing in the middle of a desert. It was so real I could almost touch it. I opened my eyes, and the illusion shattered, replaced by the brown, jagged hills and the sight of Davis sitting nearby, cleaning his fingernails with a piece of metal, his face a mask of dull, gray apathy. "Do you think they'll send him home in first class?" I asked, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I was thinking of Miller's joke, the one he'd made in the sandstorm. Davis looked up, his eyes glassy and distant. He didn't smile. He just shrugged, a slow, heavy movement of his shoulders. "Does it matter?" he said, his voice flat. "He won't know the difference." The cruelty of his honesty hit me like a slap. I felt a surge of anger, not at Davis, but at the truth. He was right. It didn't matter. The first-class seat, the casket, the folded flag, it was all for the people back home, for the parents and the wives and the sisters who needed to believe that their loss meant something. But for Miller, he was already gone. He was just part of the geography now. I looked at my hands, the dried blood finally flaking away, leaving raw pink skin underneath, and I felt a strange, detached peace. I was still here. I was still breathing. I was still moving, and that was the only truth that mattered. I stood up, adjusting my vest, the weight of the gear pressing down on me, a familiar grounding burden. I looked at the squad, these broken, tired, and desperate men who were the only family I had left. I loved them not with the clean, soft love I felt for Sarah, but with a fierce, protective, and terrified love that was forged in the heat and the blood. They were the only ones who knew what I knew, the only ones who saw the world as it really was. We were a brotherhood of ghosts, bound together by the things we'd done and the things we'd lost. "Let's move," I said, my voice steady, sounding like a stranger's voice. We stepped out of the compound, back into the harsh, blinding sunlight, back into the maze of the valley. The heat was waiting for us, a physical wall that pushed back against our chests. I looked ahead at the path winding through the rocks, and I didn't look for the end of it. I didn't look for home. I looked for the next step, just the next step. I moved forward, my boots crunching on the dry, parched earth, the sound rhythmic and hypnotic, the heartbeat of a life I was forced to live. I was still here, still in the middle of the storm, and the worst part, the part that kept me moving even when I wanted to stop, was knowing that I was the only one who could tell the story of the man I used to be, and the man I had become, as long as I was still standing. The valley opened up before us, a vast, empty stretch of nothingness, and I walked into it, the sun casting my shadow long and thin against the ground, a dark, silent companion that never once looked back at where we'd been. The radio started to crackle again, a voice calling for status update, but I didn't hear the words. I only heard the static, the sound of a world that refused to stop moving, even when the pieces of it were falling away, one by one, into the dust. I held my breath, felt the weight of the rifle against my chest, and stepped into the heat, the silence of the valley ringing in my ears like a judgment. I already knew what was coming. We all knew, but we kept walking anyway. The final weeks in the valley blurred into a monochromatic haze of grit and exhaustion. We stopped counting the days. We stopped tracking the missions by anything other than the number of empty canteens and the rising tally of things we could no longer speak about. I remember one afternoon, standing on a ridgeline while the sun turned the horizon into a smear of bruised copper, feeling absolutely nothing. I watched a mortar team from another company prep their tubes down in the basin, their movements precise and practiced, and I felt like I was watching an instructional video from a lifetime ago. The sound of the outgoing fire didn't even make me flinch anymore. I just checked the integrity of my own boots, adjusted the strap of my rifle, and waited for the command to move. The humanity had been polished off of us, replaced by a smooth, cold functionality. We were machines built to navigate a landscape that wanted us gone, and we were very, very good at it. When the order finally came to pull back to the FOB to prepare for the lift-out, there was no celebration, no cheering. We just packed our gear in silence, the same way we had packed Miller's stuff a lifetime ago. I walked through the barracks tent, tossing my gear into the sea bag, and I found a crumpled pack of cigarettes he'd left on his cot. I didn't smoke them. I didn't toss them. I just stared at the brand, the familiar red and white box, and felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to sit down on the frame of the bunk. The silence in that tent was deafening. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the weight of all the words we hadn't said, the jokes that would never be finished, the future that had been amputated. I realized then that I wasn't just bringing myself home. I was carrying the entire squad in the folds of my brain, a permanent phantom passenger list that I would have to account for every single day until I hit the dirt myself. The flight home was a pressurized tube of nightmares and bad coffee. We sat in the dark, the roar of the engines vibrating through our teeth, our eyes fixed on the metal bulkheads. Nobody slept. We sat in a state of suspended animation, somewhere between the world we had wrecked and the world we had left behind. I kept closing my eyes and seeing that flicker, the yellowed grass, the wet thud, the surprise on Miller's face. Every time the plane banked, I felt my heart drop into my stomach, braced for the crash, braced for the end. I wanted to tell the man next to me to grab the handle, to tell him that we were going to be okay, but I didn't know his name anymore. I had forgotten who we were in the scramble to survive. I looked out the tiny, reinforced window at the moon reflecting off the clouds, and I realized I had no idea how to exist in a world where you didn't have to keep your head down to stay alive. The touchdown at the airfield felt like a lie. The wheels hitting the tarmac with that sharp, mechanical chirp. It sounded too clean, too orderly. We stepped off the ramp into the humid night air, and it didn't smell like jet fuel or cordite. It smelled like cut grass and wet pavement and something sweet like honeysuckle. It was a sensory assault. I stood there on the concrete, my duffel bag cutting into my shoulder, and I felt like a ghost haunting a carnival. The people around us, the support staff, the ground crew, the families waiting behind the rope, they were moving at a speed I couldn't comprehend. They looked like they were in a film playing at the wrong frame rate. I saw a woman near the fence laughing at something her husband said, and I felt a surge of pure, jagged rage. How could she laugh? How could anyone be happy when the world was so thin? I gripped the handle of my bag until my fingers went numb, staring at her, waiting for her to stop, but she didn't. She just kept laughing, her head thrown back, completely oblivious to the fact that I was standing 10 yards away with the ghost of a man named Miller still clawing at my chest. I saw her in the crowd then. Sarah. She was wearing that blue coat I remembered, her hair pulled back just the way I liked it, but she looked like a stranger. The face was the same, the eyes were the same, but the distance between us felt like a chasm that no amount of running could close. When she saw me, her expression shifted from search to recognition, and she started running, her boots clicking on the pavement. I didn't run to meet her. I stood still, rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of the last year pressing me into the ground. She hit me with a force that knocked the air out of my lungs, wrapping her arms around my neck, her face buried in my shoulder. She was crying. I could feel the heat of her tears soaking through my uniform. I wanted to hold her, to pull her into me so hard we'd become one person, but my arms felt like lead. They were stiff, useless things. I finally brought them up, patting her back in a clumsy, rhythmic motion that felt like tapping out a code she would never understand. I was home, but the version of me that had left was still in the valley, and the version that was here was just a hollow shell meant to satisfy the requirements of a reality I no longer belonged to. The drive to her house was a blur of neon signs and streetlights that felt like stars burning in the wrong sky. She talked, her voice a soft, frantic melody, asking about the flight, asking about the food, asking if I was tired. I nodded, I grunted, I stared out the window at the passing blur of strip malls and gas stations. Every sound, a car horn, a siren, the distant rumble of a highway, made my muscles tense, my hand twitching toward a rifle that wasn't there. I was a wire under constant, agonizing tension. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. It looked like a dollhouse, fragile and easily broken. I stepped inside and the smell hit me, laundry detergent and cinnamon. It was so overwhelmingly domestic that I almost broke down right there in the entryway. I stood in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the ceiling to collapse, waiting for the blast that would tell me this was all a trick. Nothing happened. The refrigerator hummed. A clock ticked in the kitchen. The house was safe, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, watching the shadows crawl across the ceiling. Sarah was asleep, her breathing deep and rhythmic, a sound so peaceful it made my chest ache. I felt like a predator who had wandered into a sanctuary. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of coffee, the sound of the pot dripping like a timer counting down to a disaster. I sat at the table, my back to the wall, watching the door. I knew logically that I was safe, that the war was 8,000 miles away, but my body didn't believe it. My body was still in the dirt. It was still waiting for the ambush. It was still calculating the distance to the next cover. I looked at the kitchen window, at the suburban street bathed in the orange glow of a streetlight, and I felt a profound, bottomless grief. I had come back, but I had left the only part of myself that knew how to be happy in the valley with Miller. The months that followed were a long, slow exercise in survival. I went to the VA, sitting in a beige room with a man who smelled like stale peppermint and looked at me with eyes that had never seen a sunrise from the belly of a crater. I tried to talk, but the words were like jagged stones in my throat. Every time I tried to explain, I ended up talking about the heat, or the sound of the radio, or the way the dust tasted. I never talked about Miller. I never talked about the blood on my hands. I talked about logistics, about the weather, about the mechanics of the patrol, because those were the only things I could articulate without shattering. The counselor nodded, scribbled on his pad, and told me about grounding techniques. Asterisk focus on the carpet, asterisk he'd say. Asterisk count the tiles on the floor. Asterisk I did it. I counted the tiles. I counted the cracks in the wall. I counted the heartbeats until I could leave. It didn't stop the nightmares. It just made me better at hiding them. I tried to go back to the shop, but the tools felt wrong in my hands. The heavy wrench, the ratchet, they felt like toys. I'd be working on a car, a simple oil change, and a sudden bang from the street would drop me to the floor before my brain even processed the sound. I'd be on my knees, my breath gone, my fingers clawing at the concrete, waiting for the follow-up, and then I'd look up and see a customer standing there, staring at me like I was a broken clock. I'd stand up, wipe the grease on my jeans, and say it was nothing, just a dizzy spell. I was a man living two lives, one that was visible and mundane, and one that was hidden and screaming. The guilt was the worst. It was a physical weight, a constant pressure on my chest. Why was I here, struggling with a socket wrench while Miller was in the ground? Why did I get to walk away when the bill came due? I started to resent the peace. I hated the silence of the morning. I hated the way people complained about trivial things, a late delivery, a cold lunch, a traffic jam, and I wanted to grab them by the collar and shake them until they understood that none of it mattered, and all of it was a gift they were wasting. I remember the first time I laughed. We were at a dinner party a year after I got back. Someone told a story about a dog chasing a mailman, and for a split second, I felt a flicker of the old me. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh, and then I stopped. Mid-laugh, I stopped. I looked at the faces around the table, the wine glasses, the smiles, and I realized how far away I was from them. I felt like an imposter. I felt like I was wearing a suit made of skin that didn't fit, acting out a role I hadn't rehearsed. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, staring at the man in the mirror. He looked old. He looked tired. He looked like a stranger who had seen the bottom of the ocean and had nothing to show for it but a handful of sand. I wanted to tell Sarah, but she didn't want to hear the dark stuff. She wanted her husband back, the one who worked at the shop and listened to the radio and talked about the future. I was playing that man, but I was failing, and the gap was widening every day. But there were moments. Small, specific, quiet moments. One Sunday, I was out in the backyard, helping Sarah with the garden. It was hot, the kind of heat that reminded me of the valley, but the air smelled like tomatoes and turned earth instead of dust and rot. We were planting corn, our hands deep in the soil, the work mindless and repetitive. I looked at her, at the way the sun caught the stray hairs at her temple, and I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't happiness, not the simple, uncomplicated kind I used to know, but it was something solid. It was a sense of presence. I realized that the nightmare was a part of me, just like the scar on my palm or the way I checked the locks at night, but it wasn't the whole of me. I could sit in the dirt and plant seeds, and that was a victory. It was a small, fragile victory, but it was mine. I reached out and took her hand, the soil cool between our fingers, and I didn't let go. I don't go to the VA anymore. I stopped needing to talk to a man who hadn't been there. I found my own way to keep the ghost of Miller quiet. I take long drives, sometimes for hours, just listening to the hum of the tires on the asphalt, the way the road stretches out into a future I'm finally beginning to believe in. I still have the nightmares. I still wake up with my heart trying to kick its way out of my chest, staring at the ceiling until the sun hits the curtains. But the frequency is changing. The images are losing their sharp edges, turning into soft, faded photographs instead of high-definition film. I'm still here. I'm still standing. That is the truth I carry now. It's not a badge of honor, and it's not a mark of shame. It's just the fact of my existence. Sarah asked me last night if I was ever going to tell her the rest of it. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand resting on my knee, the silence in the room heavy and expectant. I looked at her, at the woman who had waited through the silence and the distance, and the man who had come back broken, and I didn't say anything. I just shook my head. She didn't press. She knew. She understood that some things can't be translated, that the language of the valley isn't spoken in suburbs or kitchen tables. She just leaned over and rested her forehead against mine, and in that moment, the war felt like a distant, dying echo. I still think about Miller every single day. I think about the burger he never got, and the tractor he never fixed, and the way the light died in his eyes. I carry him and I carry the others, and I think that's why I'm still here. Someone has to remember. Someone has to keep the record straight, even if the only person who ever knows the truth is the man sitting in the dark, writing it all down in his head. I don't know if I'm fixed. I don't think you ever get fixed after something like that. You just get reshaped. You become a vessel that holds a little more gravity than the people around you, a little more awareness of how thin the ice really is. But I'm moving forward. I'm living in this house, in this town, with this woman who loves a man she barely recognizes, and I'm finding that even the dark has its own kind of beauty if you look at it long enough. I have hope. It's not the bright, shiny, naive hope of my younger self. It's a quiet, jagged, tempered hope. It's the hope that tomorrow will be just another day, and that maybe in that day, I'll find a way to let go of just a little bit more of the weight. Tonight, the house is quiet. The kids are asleep. They're breathing a soft, steady rhythm through the floorboards. I'm sitting on the back porch, a cold cup of coffee in my hand, looking out at the woods behind our fence. The moon is full, casting long, silver shadows through the trees, and the crickets are singing, a steady, rhythmic pulse that reminds me of nothing in particular. It's just a Tuesday in Ohio. I'm 35 years old, my knees ache when the weather changes, and I have a job that I don't love but that keeps the roof over our heads. I take a sip of the coffee. It's bitter and lukewarm, but I drink it anyway. I look at my hand, the one that held Miller's vest, the one that felt his life drain away into the dry, abrasive dirt. I turn it over, palms up, and watch the moonlight catch the lines in my skin. I am a man who went away and came back, and I am still here. That is enough. That has to be enough. I set the cup down on the table, the ceramic clinking against the wood, and I listen to the wind moving through the leaves. It's a long way from the valley, but the wind sounds the same everywhere. I close my eyes and breathe, really breathe, feeling the air fill my lungs, clean and cold and entirely my own. I don't check the perimeter. I don't scan for movement. I just sit in the dark, a man in his own backyard, finally understanding that the war didn't end because the fighting stopped. It ended because I decided to stop fighting it. I'm going to go inside now, wake up early and drive to the shop, and for the first time in a decade, I'm not worried about what happens if the sun doesn't come up. I'm just going to sleep. I'm just going to sleep.